geografía y a las 9.
Hello everyone, welcome to Self-Knowledge. Today, as every Sunday, we have our self-knowledge lectures, and today we're having lecture number 39 of this course, and today we are going to talk about the non-identification with the things of the daily life and why we judge others. And the objective of studying this topic will be to learn not to identify ourselves with the situations that we have in our daily living, and not to criticize to prevent the consciousness from falling asleep. And so, by doing so, we'll begin to experience advances in our inner work. Let's start by talking a little about the non-identification. What is to become identified? This is a term that may be new to us. And to become identified is to be identical to a psychological defect, and to let a defect take over our body, our human machine. For example, if in a violent situation the person becomes identified with anger, he will be identical to anger. Then he hits, mistreats, yells, only thinks about hurting, mistreating, and he will only feel things like hatred, resentment, etc. All this is part of the defect of anger. One identifies or becomes identified with the defect, and then lets the defect take over all the centers of the human machine, and it is going to express in all our centers, in our mind, in our emotion, in our instinctive, in our even in our sexual center, and in our motor center, because it will use our verb to express and with the actions. So the problem with becoming identified with a defect is that the identification slips the consciousness. As long as a defect is acting in us, our consciousness will not be acting. Using the same example of anger, as long as I am identified with anger, yelling, and mistreating, my consciousness has no chance at all to manifest. If, for example, I'm on the street and an accident happens and I become identified with the situation, I forget about myself, my consciousness will fall asleep. Or let's say that if I am at work and I see my coworker with a new cell phone, brand new, so expensive, and I start feeling like dislike, annoyance, envy, because even she earns less than me and she was able to buy that cell phone, etc. I am identified there. And when night comes, and I start to do my retrospection practice to review my whole day, I will realize that I was identified all day with the things that happened during the day. And that is how we walk: asleep during the day and asleep at night. And that is why we don't go out conscious to the astral plane, because we are asleep the whole day and we continue asleep during the night. And we must begin to understand that life is actually like a movie. We have nice events, but we also have unpleasant events. However, they are all temporary. A year ago, we had some problems that at the time seemed very important and complex, and now those problems are gone. they don't worry us anymore because everything passed away. What worried us a week ago doesn't worry us right now. Everything is temporary. Time is temporary. And everything we experience in this physical world is temporary. Time swallows it. And the only thing that doesn't pass is the being, because it is eternal. Therefore, the only thing that should interest us is the being, it's our consciousness, because the being doesn't pass. The rest in this world is illusory and temporary. That I lost some money, that I was cheated in a business, or that my partner cheated on me, if I become identified, I will suffer. But then I will forget it and it will pass. But the mind magnifies all problems. When we have a problem, whatever the problem is, we tend to magnify the problem. We give it a lot of mind. We worry and we keep thinking and thinking until we begin to feel like small and like unable to face and to solve the problem. And we begin to perceive the problem as something like too big, that something that has no solution. And when we come to see a problem as a monster that we cannot handle, at that moment our identification is great and the consciousness is totally asleep. However, if we really understand this topic that we are seeing today, in this situation, in every situation when a problem arrives, we will remember that what happened to us is nothing more than a passing circumstance, like everything else in this world. That, for example, I couldn't pay a installment loan at the bank because the money I was expecting didn't come in. So I start to worry about it, and it goes from being just a circumstance to becoming a problem. When I turn a circumstance into a problem, that's when the suffering begins. Because with my mind, I'm creating something that is not even real, and I am like enlarging it with my mind. And when one begins with the mechanical imagination to project that the worst things are gonna happen, that for not paying the bank, I will go to the jail, that my children will starve, etc. And meanwhile, I am suffering as if it were real, as if all this were actually happening. And we can see how by falling into identification, there are people who by falling into identification come to commit suicide because they turned a circumstance into a problem in their mind, and that monster got bigger, and a monster that is unreal. And we create them with the mind by thinking and thinking about it and overthinking about it. And all problems, we need to know that all problems are created by ourselves. And the more we think and the more we imagine, we magnify it. And when that happens, people just don't see a way out. And why? Because the consciousness has not been able to manifest itself because we were so worried, we were with all the fear, we were imagining all those situations, and the consciousness cannot manifest when we are in that state, when we are in that state of identification with that circumstance. And the important thing is to see how the problems are due to fear, all problems. So if we want to actually solve a problem, we must take like the bull by the horns and discover what are the fears that are behind that problem, and by finding the fears, we are going to be able to see what are the psychological defects that are behind those fears. What are the fears for not paying the bank? Well, the fear of going to jail, the fear that my family will suffer, that they will go hungry. And if we discover the fears, we take that monster by the horns because we are facing it. Then we come to understand that consciousness is never afraid. Consciousness is wise. Consciousness is happy all the time. So who feels those fears? The psychological defect that through mechanical imagination is making me think that that is going to happen, and it's projecting all those scenarios. So when we find those psychological defects behind the fears, when we eliminate with the psychological death those psychological defects that are causing us those fears and that have us projecting all kinds of terrifying futures with our minds, the problem becomes a circumstance, and then the consciousness can manifest, and consciousness can resolve any situation because our consciousness is full wisdom. If a problem doesn't exist within us, it is impossible for it to manifest outside. If it manifests outside, it is because it is rooted inside us. So we must find that root, which is the hidden defect behind the fear, and we must eliminate it. So the consciousness can manifest and we get to a clear situation. So we need to find what is behind, if it is greed, or if it is envy, or if it is lust, or if it is anything. We need to actually reflect. We need to see what are those fears and to find the defect behind the fear. And once we are in that state, the consciousness is actually manifesting, and our consciousness is able to resolve any situation in the simplest way. The most important thing is that we learn to see problems as opportunities. Since in pleasant circumstances, there's not so much material to rescue consciousness, actually. But in the most complicated situations is where the heaviest selves arise in us. And therefore, because they are stronger ones, they have trapped the greatest amount of our consciousness. And if we know how to use them, these circumstances become actually wonderful opportunities to discover ourselves and to rescue a lot of consciousness and a lot of wisdom by, yes, applying the psychological depth, the self-observation, discovering our psychological defects and asking to our Divine Mother to eliminate them. If someone insults us and we at that moment begin to observe our interior, actually the consciousness feasts because we see everything that is expressing within us. The self of anger, the murdered one, the one who wants to hit, everything, and we must begin to see how these defects are actually like making us do what they want. And if we are just identified with the defect, it is very difficult for us to realize what defect is actually manifesting in us. Even though if we have the anger acting in us and someone tells us, hey, you are like a very angry, I'm not angry at all. And we are so identified with the defect. But if we like stop, we practice the self-observation, then we will be able to not to become identified with any of our psychological defects, and there we will be able to judge them and to eliminate each one of them. Now let's study this other aspect that prevents the awakening of our consciousness. It is why we judge others. It's necessary to know that we really don't know ourselves and that all the people on the outside serves as a mirror to see ourselves reflected. If every time someone with a defect appears, we observe ourselves, we can see that something is moving us to react and that it doesn't want us to observe to our interior. And that is why it reacts and tries to make us criticize in what this or that person is doing to fall asleep our consciousness so we cannot discover our own psychological defect that is actually manifesting at that moment. What bothers us about someone is just something that we carry hidden within our psychology and we don't like to see it from the outside. That is why we criticize it. So the law of the mirror shows us that everything we see in other people is what we have most deeply rooted in our interior. That is why we reflect our defects in other people, and that is why we feel irritation, because the ego is always offended when it sees its reflection. If a person is like a very lustful, he will always see lust in other people. If he is irresponsible, he will always see irresponsibility in other people. So the best way to get to know ourselves is to see what we criticize the most. There we discover amazing things about ourselves, because we will discover things that are in us and that until that moment we had not even recognized and much less accepted. If I really had the opposite virtue to the defects that I am criticizing, I wouldn't criticize. I would understand that person. An easy example can be seen with the alcoholic self. The one who drinks alcohol is at the active pole of that defect, while the abstainer is at the passive pole. But being abstemious doesn't imply that one has understanding, that the opposite virtue to that defect has already been rescued. Only has the repressed defect in his interior. And this is actually manifested every time he feels dislike and rejection by whoever is actively feeding the psychological defect, in this case, the alcoholic defect. On the contrary, those who have already studied, understood, and eliminated their alcoholic self already know all the strategies of the defect, how it submits the person, the justifications of the defect, how they make a person feel, and they already understand the defect, and therefore, instead of criticizing who is being driven by that psychological defect, rather he tries to help him by giving him the knowledge so that he can get out of there if he chooses so. Let's now see what the consequences of criticism are. When we criticize others, we can actually not self-observe ourselves, because our vision is totally focused on what the other does or what the other says. So we lose the wonderful opportunity to self-discover and the wonderful opportunity to transform ourselves, because we are just looking to the outside. It also, or the critical judgment will also fall asleep. Critical judgment is the ability we have to judge ourselves, to judge our own psychological defects. When we criticize others, we cannot see our defects, and we will always justify ourselves, because when we criticize, it is because we feel superior, we feel better than the one that we criticize. And we must understand that criticism is the strategy that our psychological defects, that is our ego, use so that we never discover them, so that we never judge them, and so that we never eliminate them. And since the one who criticizes doesn't understand and he hasn't learned anything from that defect, he will be put in the other people's shoes. He will have to live that same situation, and of course, we always end up acting just like the one that we criticize. Another point is that we must know that the judgment that we make of another is always a slander. Since we don't even know ourselves, less we are going to know all the internal situations that lead a person to be and to act as they do. Another consequence of criticism is that it generates bad relationships with other people. Every time that we are criticizing, we are actually generating bad relationships with everyone. Even if we are just thinking badly of a person, at that moment, our psychological defects are communicating telepathically with the other person's defects, and that other person start feeling like annoyed towards us, and like shock is generated, and below a reason that bad relationship is starting. And another important consequence that criticism generates for us is the karma. Since through criticism we actually harm others. So we are not charged karma for what we think or what we feel. But when we take it to an act or a word, we already generate damage and we generate karma. And actually criticism generates a lot of karma. Now, and to finish this lecture, what will be the benefits of fighting these two errors? What will be the benefits that we will obtain if we stop becoming identified and if we stop criticizing? Well, our consciousness is not going to fall asleep. We are going to be able to be in self-remembering all the time, living the here and now, self-discovering ourselves at every moment. We will recover the critical judgment, so we will be able to judge ourselves rightly. And the work with the psychological death is going to perform impressively if we stop criticizing others and if we stop becoming identified. And so we will advance a lot in our interior work. So, what is the key? The key to everything is to always direct our observation to our inner world and identifying in which pole we are, making discoveries and eliminating what is constantly being understood. If I see someone doing something that generates rejection in me, irritation in me, I must immediately turn my attention to my inner world to find, to understand, and to eliminate the defect that is at that moment reacting within me. I will discover in which pole is the defect. If I'm actually feeling the defect actively, or if the defect is repressed on me. And I will understand it and I will eliminate it. So it is important to start a fight, not to become identified and to stop judging others if we really want to awaken our consciousness. And this has been today's lecture. Thank you all for watching this video, and I will invite you to next lecture that will be next Sunday at the same time, and we are going to be talking about the sacrifice for humanity, about the importance of helping others or doing our part to help others to awaken their consciousness. So thank you very much and have a great rest of the day. Ciao, ciao.